Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. This is the second half of episode 12. If you didn't get to see the first half, make sure to check it out. But if this is the first one that you're viewing, don't worry. We are covering more ideas that came from the Renaissance, and the episodes are a little bit independent of each other. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So, Renaissance, it means rebirth. But it's not that simple, honestly, as these old ideas came back to Western Europe and to the continent in general. Lots of new ideas also sprang forth. Because these ideas were in a new context, even though they were old concepts, they had to be reworked and to be reimagined. Art is very peculiar, and one of the greatest aspects of art is that it reflects the society which it sprang forth from. What do I mean by this exactly? When the ancient Greeks were sculpting their statues of brave warriors, of anguish, of sorrow, of victory, of conquest, these were the ideas that were very important to them. These were the concepts that they were striving for, and that meant something to them. It wasn't an accident that the ideas and the concepts that they were most driven by were what was most represented in their art. And as the Hellenistic period drove on, we notice that these images become less grand and become more mundane and a little bit more flowing. As Hellenistic society left the Greek peninsula and spread across a huge area, the ideas and the concepts of the Greeks in themselves had to become more fluid and more encompassing. We see this with art in this period of the Renaissance as well. Previously, in just about all cultures and societies, art had very specific functions. They reminded you of concepts which were important to your society. They told stories which those peoples had very dear to themselves. And they were ways for artists and for their patrons to show their expertise, their ability to reproduce reality, and their mastery of the world around them. As the Renaissance came back and as these people started to regain these ideas, they also began to expand on them. So let's take a little look at humanism and what it means exactly and why it's so important at this period in time. Humanism is the study of the condition of man. Now, what exactly is the condition of man? That's a very good question, one which people are still hotly debating today with our own current ideologies that are swirling over the globe. Now, humanism was a focus on the average person and on the mundane. Before this period in time, when you look at the masses, you get general overviews. Even the Romans weren't really all that focused on the plebes and how they lived their lives and what it was that they did from day to day. Lots of history from antiquity into the early Middle Ages is focused on individual rulers and leaders, what they did, what concepts and what ideas drove them, their wars and things like that. And even then, before they came to power and when they were young, is generally discarded and not thought about. This began to change as humanism came to the forefront and the average person and the average life began to come much more to the surface. So, what is the condition of man? There's two very basic and fundamental concepts that are in conflict when you're trying to decide the answer to this question. It can be broken down very simply into two camps. The first one believes that man started as a beast and is on the rise. He came from the wild. He taught himself to cook. He taught himself to read and to write and to build society. So the first idea of the nature of man is a rising beast moving towards the stars. The second is what is much more entrenched in older theology and older Christianity, and that's the concept of man as a fallen angel, we'll say. That is to say that man started out in a pure, good, and much higher state, and has degraded or fallen since then, needing to reach up rather than to reach out. These two ideas would come into conflict many times, over and over again, even in today's world. And one of the easiest areas where this conflict of man as a rising beast versus man as a fallen angel can be seen was in the Protestant movement. This is a little bit later than the Renaissance, but it has a lot to do with humanism, with the nature of man, and with the growth and development of new ideas in Europe. So I'd like to take a quick look at it here. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover a lot of it. That'll be a separate video, but let's just real quick take a look at Protestantism. So what was Catholicism? As previously mentioned in a video, there was 5 holy sees, and each one had a little bit different flavor of Christianity that it tried to spread to its constituents. In the West, there was one holy see, and that was Rome. So if you were in England, if you were in Sweden, if you were somewhere far away from Italy where you had very little contact with them, you had to follow the rules of a foreign leader that you had never met, that you had never heard, that didn't know anything about you, your people, and your culture. This was very much in contrast with the way that the rulers and even the people of those areas wanted to run their lives. The way that a Roman, or an Italian, I suppose we should say, views his religion, views his culture, can be very different. And if your nation decides to do something which is against the Pope's willing, there's not a whole lot of room to move on. Now, it's a very interesting concept. The Pope, we like to think about in terms of like the 13th century, like 1200 to 1300 AD, as being this very powerful figure. But the truth is that wasn't really the way it was for most of his history. In fact, today priests aren't allowed to marry. We all know that. That was actually a papal bull that was promulgated in, I want to say it was the 12th century AD. So for half of the existence of the old Catholicism, priests were not only allowed to marry, they were expected to. They began to accumulate wealth and influence, and they kept this within their families, which challenged the power of the Pope. Now, a lot of these challenges from foreign kings, from priests and bishops and their families, began to accumulate and to drag on the Pope. And as Christianity became more solidified and as society began to recover and to grow, the Pope's influence began to explode relative to that. So in the 14th century the Pope became very powerful, and he almost became something like a dictator of all of Europe. This wasn't very much enjoyed by the various nobles and kings of the continent, and it definitely wasn't enjoyed by the peasants and the poor people who couldn't afford his indulgences and his works to get into heaven. So a lot of new ideas began to spread, and the concept of the ability to manipulate and to better oneself through new ideas and through new study of the Bible, which previously had to be handwritten and could now be made on a printing press, began to really shake the old foundation. This led to Protestantism, the protest of the old religion. They still wanted the moral reconciliation and the ethical ability to determine what was right and what was wrong, but now they needed a new way of representing themselves, their own culture, and their own ways, which was this new religious movement, which came to really shake the foundations and set the tone for the next several centuries. One of the great and lasting forms of art which really took roots in the Middle Ages and leading up to the Renaissance was architecture. Now, architecture had always been very important, but the Romans liked to use large single pieces and to move these from quarries across long distances using their famous roads and using their extensive trade networks. These resources were no longer available as the old order came to fall and as Europe became a patchwork of warring states through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. So it's actually very impressive that we have a lot of these large monuments to these old cultures still standing today. One that we're going to take a look at is the cathedral in Seville in Spain. This is one of the largest and grandest of these old cathedrals, and we're not going to be able to go as in-depth as I would like in this one video, but I do want to give a sort of basic overview of two periods of architecture so that we can dive much greater depth into them later, those being Romanesque and Gothic. Now, Romanesque sounds very familiar, right? It is influenced by the old Roman style, and it really shows the transition from Romanesque to Gothic, really shows the impact that the Renaissance had on art and on these people's lives. So, before the Gothic style came into play, the buildings were very simple. They're the way you would imagine that a child would stack Legos. You take lots of rocks cut well, you stack them on top of each other in some sort of pattern, and you end up roofing it off. They did have lots of different forms of arches. They did have lots of ways to preserve negative space, meaning places where there wasn't stone or whatever you were using to construct, where they could insert windows, where they could let in light, but these were difficult to have in multiple places and to have frequently because you needed to support the building as it grew taller. Because of this necessity for strong bases, you ended up having very closed off and very sort of out of touch buildings, which didn't seem to embrace the land around them and to really show the style and the effort that went into them. One brilliant and very interesting fact about these old churches and about these old constructions is that they tended to take centuries. These were not things that a single artist could produce on his own. They were not things that a single artist and his team of workers could produce on their own. These were ideas and masterpieces that had to be refined and worked on by a community, by a group of people, through time until it was finished. Now, because of this, new ideas and inventions would come to the fore. And as these buildings were built and developed, and as they grew taller, they became better at working with the materials. One extremely important innovation that was developed, which blew past the old Romanesque ways and rolled on into the new Gothic style, was the idea of the flying buttress. Sounds a little funny, but I'm going to very simply explain how this works. A buttress is an increased area of support so that a wall could sustain more of the load from the top of the building than it would if it was flatter and thinner. Because of buttresses, they could allow for more negative space, which could be filled with intricate and beautiful glass, which allowed the light in, and became sort of a metaphor for God and his coming into a person. As the light filled the glass and filled the church, so too did the wisdom of God fill the vessel of the humanist thinker. So the buttresses became larger and larger And then someone had a brilliant idea. What happens if we removed them entirely and replaced the inside with glass? This is where the flying buttress came to the fore, and basically what it meant was a pillar which was separated from the building itself and helped to support the weight, and in between it allowed for more negative space, which allowed for even more artistic work and creativity. This is, as I stated, very interesting because if the Renaissance was the rebirth of old Roman ways, and Romanesque architecture was standard Roman building to begin with, it shows how even old ideas could impact dramatically other old ideas to bring new ideas, concepts, and art to the front. So even those ideas which had been carried over from the old Roman times, when they were filtered through the new societies and through the new cultures, came to give birth to further ideas. Not only was a Renaissance the rebirth of old ways, it was also the birth of new ways. So, now it's time to wrap up this episode. I really didn't get to cover nearly as much as I would have liked to, but again, this is a general overview of the arts from these periods so that in the future, when we go to look at more specific ideas and topics, we'll have something that we can start from and we have a general idea. So, to wrap up, I want to look a little bit at the art in the Northern Renaissance. This is not as well known as the Italian, the French, and the English Renaissances. It's another one of my personal favorites. It is very humanist driven, as this was one of the centers of the Protestant movement, and therefore one of the centers of the development of the humanist concepts and philosophies. The focus on the individual was very pronounced, and as the various plagues, endemic warfare, and other concepts came to the fore, the focus on the individual became much greater. But not only that, art in the past has been much more than simply expressions of captured perspectives as we look at art on this channel. It also had a very specific use in certain contexts. Marriage contracts, pictures of certain people, and different kinds of portraiture and other things like this were all done in art. And so the everyday artist would have had a lot on his plate when it came to different sorts of commissions, different sorts of paintings. So at this time, you could make a living by painting the average person, whereas before, you would have had to have found a rich patron, which means you would have had to have satisfied that rich patron's tastes. And before we go on to the next concept, I also really want to express that we do look at these works of art and we see them and we say, these are fantastic, this is art. But beyond that, at this point, artists couldn't go to a shop and buy a tube of paint and a brush and a canvas. This led to really workshop-driven art. By workshop, I mean you had to have a place where you could generate your canvas, stretch it onto a frame. You had to take the pigments that you wanted from nature, mostly different colors, and you had to take the mediums, the oils. There was a lot of egg whites were actually used, and various different ways of suspending these pigments as they would dry on the canvas. So it wasn't just the work of art that they were putting onto the canvas, onto the fresco, onto whatever they were painting. The entire experience of going into the wild, finding your blue, red, and yellow, mixing them into the colors that you wanted to have as your palette. This was all very intensive, and it was a lot of work, and it needed a lot of wealth in order to be able to feed yourself from these different kinds of works. So not only were these artists working for the rich as they had been previously, they also began to work for the poor. There's various reasons for this. One of them is that the wealth of the individual at the lower end of society began to grow as there was fewer of them due to things like the Black Death, but also war had previously been a rich man's game. And as the Renaissance and as these times grew on, war became a much more all-encompassing idea, and more people had to be brought into it. And if you were going to go die for your state, for people that you didn't much care for, you had to be motivated. One way that the state has continuously motivated people throughout time is payment. So there was a lot of different reasons why the lower classes began to develop. They could get their hands on books, which they previously couldn't. They could get their hands on wealth, which they previously couldn't. And this sort of democratization of art really began to shift what could be captured. And as the societies began to generate more art focused on the little guy, it reflected the society itself being more and more focused on the little guy. Well, thank you very much for watching today. I hope that you enjoyed. Like I said before, this takes a lot of time and effort, and I just got to a new location. Between this and work and painting and a lot of other things, I'm going to do my best to get as many of these videos out as regularly as I can. But thank you very much for watching. It's very great to receive the support from you guys. I'm doing whatever I can to make sure that I improve from one video to the next. I think the audio is going to be a lot better in this one than it has been previously. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's anything else that you would like to dive into more explicitly. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.